Welcome to Life Empowers with Melissa Ohden. Where there is life, there is hope. Where there is life, there's a place for love to grow, and love emboldens and strengthens. Where there is life, there's an opportunity to grow and be empowered. I'm living testament to that, and you are too. And if you don't yet feel like your life is testament to this, don't despair and don't stop listening to this podcast. This is exactly why I'm doing it. Thanks for joining me this week as we delve into so many life-affirming topics. Well, believe it or not, we're reaching the end of my first season of Life Empowers. And yes, I know it's only the end of November, but I'm going to be really honest. I'm going to take December off from recording podcasts, really focus on year-end nonprofit work right through the Abortion Survivors Network. Maybe, just maybe, take a little bit of time off to enjoy my kids and my family. But I wanted to recap before I start the next season of the Life Empowers podcast. I kind of wanted to revisit where it all began this year. I can't really believe it's almost December, right? I mean, I know we partly feel like, oh my gosh, could it please be next May already? But at the same time, I don't know, maybe I'm alone in this. I feel like overall the year has gone really quickly in the midst of so much difficulty and chaos. Maybe I'm alone in that. Don't hate this podcast if you're feeling otherwise. But yeah, it has gone quickly. And, it's been such an honor and a joy for me to have this time to really focus on the work of the Abortion Survivors Network and really start this podcast to increase my reach through my own, personal ministry. But really, my own personal ministry always points back to the work of the Abortion Survivors Network, because that's why I do what I do, is not just to share my story, but to highlight the overall cause of all abortion survivors and make sure that abortion survivors are seen and heard and supported and are given a platform and the opportunity to find their voice and use their voice. So, the podcast has been a great opportunity for me to share the overall message about abortion survivors and really create a space for us to hear more about so many people who are often unheard of in our society. So I wanted to recap about where this all started, why it started, and hopefully get some feedback from you. Gosh, I would love at the end of this podcast if people would drop me a comment, send me an email to melissa@abortionsurvivors.com. I would love to hear about what you would like to see me cover in the next season that will start in January for the podcast. Give me some ideas if there are certain survivors or other people in the pro-life community that you'd love to have me interview. Your feedback would be so incredibly helpful to me as I start this next season. So please feel free to give me that feedback. We are in this together. So where did it all begin with the Life Empowers podcast? Most people probably don't even realize this, but the podcast first aired in April of 2020. And honestly, when you reflect upon that, right, it feels like that was light years ago. But really, when I first started the podcast, I'm going to be perfectly honest, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, just knew that I was called to share in a greater way. And even the first episode was entitled Purpose in the Pandemic. That was the initial episode. And, I can still remember somehow that very first episode, I worked so hard to craft it. And I don't know, it got lost somewhere in the internet atmosphere, believe it or not. And it just poof, it was gone. And so it took me a couple of takes to even get that initial episode back. And even then, I didn't have music, right? I didn't know how to record the intros and the outros. And I share this with you because I hope it provides you some encouragement. Some people know this about me, friends know this. My husband's an IT guy. He is so gifted. I am so grateful for him. But he could only help me so much when it came to this podcast. This is kind of outside of his expertise, but he is the greatest encouragement to me, saying, Miss, if you're going to do something, do it right. Do your homework, right? Find the people who can help you. But if you're going to do something, do it the right way. And, this is still a process. I don't have everything 100% right, but I can tell you I put my nose to the grindstone, watched a lot of videos, did a lot of studying, and figured out how to start really making the podcast as professional as I can with my own, time and know-how. So, I share that with you as an encouragement because I know so many people want to do a podcast or feel like there's something else that they're called to do, and you're thinking, I can't do this. I don't know where to start. I can't. Well, guess what? If I can start to tackle this, you can too. So, like I said, still in process, but man, I feel like I learned so much, and I am grateful to look back on it and know that that was a skill, right? I gained something as I grappled with this, as we all do. So, that was the first episode, as unprofessional as it probably was, but it was really about finding purpose and peace in the midst of the pandemic. And I know this has been hard for a lot of people, right? How do we find peace? How do we find purpose in the midst of something that is upending our lives on a daily basis and frankly scaring us, right? So many times. And, for me, as I look back on this whole year, I know the reason why it went quickly is because I really did focus my efforts on what I knew God was calling me to do. And yeah, I know that my calling is rather big and very specific, right, in the pro-life movement. But I think we all have that opportunity, right, every day to say, you know what, Lord, help me focus my attention on what I am called to do today, right? And when we focus our time and attention on what we are called to do that day, that week, that month, it ultimately ends up turning into that year, right? And we can look back and go, okay, yeah, you know what, this year was hard. This year was so difficult, but at the same time, man, I accomplished so many things, right? I was able to do so much. And that's really where I'm at in reflecting upon this last year, not just in this podcast, but through everything I've done, especially through the Abortion Survivors Network. If you would have told me last year at this time that we would be where we are with the programming that we've been offering, the number of survivors who have been connecting with us, just the amount of reach that we've had, and this vision that gets bigger and bigger by the day, and the transformations that we're seeing happen in survivors' lives. If you would have told me this a year ago, I would have said no way. We would not be able to do all of that in 1 year. So it's been an amazing year full of, really finding that peace and finding that purpose. And I hope that whatever 2021 brings, we're all prepared for whatever that could be at this point, right? Whatever 2021 brings for me and for survivors in our network and really all of you, I hope that we can each find peace and purpose in the midst of whatever 2021 throws at us. So that was the first episode. The second episode, oh gosh, I love reflecting back on this podcast over the last year. The second episode was entitled Face the Choice, and I interviewed my friend Lyric Gillette of Faces of Choice about that ad campaign called Face the Choice that she spearheaded in late 2019 into 2020. And I had the great blessing to unveil at the March for Life last year. That was, seriously, such a highlight of my year. And I know it was for so many of us, including my own 12-year-old Olivia. Gosh, I mean, those are some good memories. So that brings me a lot of joy to reflect on not only interviewing Lyric, but the work that we poured into that ad campaign and unveiling it at the March for Life, and seeing the voices and the faces and the stories of abortion survivors better heard and embraced. I mean, what an incredible blessing. If you didn't tune into that episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it. So it's episode 2, Face the Choice. And Lyric and I had a very candid discussion, as we always do. You should see some of our text messages, especially when we were working on trying to get it accepted as a Super Bowl ad. Man, Lyric, we had some good text messages, didn't we? But Lyric and I had a really candid conversation in that podcast episode about how the media really buries the stories of abortion survivors and other people who don't fit the predominant cultural narrative of abortion as a choice. So powerful podcast episode with Lyric. In episode 3, of course, this was another one where I believe it took me a couple of takes to get through. That's right, I remember this now. In episode 3 of Life Empowers, which actually came out in June, early June, it took a couple of takes. And this one was entitled, We See You, We Hear You, We Love You. And really the reason why it took a couple of takes to get that episode to go is because the content was so heavy. And now that I reflect upon it, I remember what it was like for me to even record that podcast episode. I was bawling, y'all. I mean, uncontrollable. Couldn't really hold myself together and ended up having to delete the first recording of that podcast episode. And the reason why it was so heavy for me is it surrounded the murder of George Floyd and the protests that happened. And yes, I know that was a very electrical time, right, in the United States. And there is still so much to unpack around that. But really my tears were about the dignity of life, about how we all want to be seen, heard, and loved. And even though the Black Lives Movement really was a huge part of that conversation, my tears also came from how much survivors can relate to wanting to be seen and heard and loved. And how really not being seen and heard and loved is such a disempowering, painful place to be. So I know that's a heavy episode. I know that people have a lot of thoughts and emotions about everything that happened back in June, but definitely worth a listen so that you can connect more to how abortion survivors have struggled for decades to be seen, to be heard, and to be loved. I want to take a quick break and give you a moment before I start going back through some more highlights of this year's episodes of the Life Empowers podcast. Well, I am back after a short break. When I last left you, we were going through episodes 1, 2, and 3 for the past year's podcast. Episode 4 was a lot of fun for me, to be honest. It was with my friend Rebecca Hagan about the abortion pill reversal. This was also a podcast we did in June. Rebecca is an amazing woman. If you don't know Rebecca's story, the spelling of her name is Rebekah. Last name Hagan, Hagan. Rebecca has an amazing story, is a wonderful woman, incredible mother and wife, accomplished speaker, just an amazing friend. And I was just so grateful to be able to share her story. We had just gotten done with a virtual event that she did for a pregnancy center near and dear to my heart, Intervisions in Des Moines, Iowa. I got to interview her virtually for that event, and so it just made so much sense for us to turn around and do a podcast. So if you want to hear more about that event that she did, about Rebecca's story of having an abortion pill reversal and the outcome of that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to episode 4 with Rebecca. Episode 5, this one makes me laugh. Episode 5 was entitled The F Word. Not that F word, folks. The other F word, feminism. Feminism and abortion. This was a fun one for me. I posed the question really in this episode of Life Empowers. Can you be a feminist and be pro-life? Where do the pro-choice arguments falter? And what's it like to be an abortion survivor who identifies as a feminist? Woo! I packed a lot of punch into that one. All I can tell you is I would strongly encourage you to go back and listen to it. That is something I am incredibly passionate about, as you can probably hear in my voice. So if you're interested in really listening into feminism and abortion, and really about abortion survivors and our connection into that argument, right, of, abortion is a woman's choice and a right, listen into episode 5. Episode 6, I really turned a corner there, to be perfectly honest. I went from feminism and abortion to episode 6 of Life Empowers being about men and abortion. I guess some would argue and say that really isn't a hard corner to turn, right? Because there are men who identify as being feminists and being pro-life. But episode 6 was really about men and abortion. And man, I had so much fun sitting down with my friend TJ Burgess of National Men for Life and one of his ambassadors, Jonathan Burton, to talk about how abortion affects men, how our culture stance on abortion impacts men, how men can get involved, and really the healing that needs to happen for men. So I am super passionate about men and abortion and the need for men to speak out and for men to find healing. So if that's something you didn't have a chance to listen into earlier in the year, I would really encourage you to go back and listen to episode 6, Men and Abortion, with TJ Burgess and Jonathan Burton from National Men for Life. So where do we go from here? The next episode that I covered in July was episode 7, and it was about the voices of women silenced by our culture. This again was something that was pretty groundbreaking, to be perfectly honest. I took an interview that I did that summer with an Australian TV show called Studio 10, actually pretty, well-known mainstream television show that had invited my birth mother, Ruth, and I to be a part of their program. Because of COVID and technology issues, Ruth wasn't on screen visually, but she did connect by phone. And this is the first time that Ruth and I ever did an interview together that was aired publicly. We actually, this is so funny. We were interviewed years ago with a big tabloid TV show who never aired it. I mean, go figure, right? I was not surprised by that. This is a pretty difficult thing for them to cover and not have to talk about the pain and truth of abortion. But anyway, that's a whole nother episode. This episode, episode 7, The Voices of Women Silenced by Our Culture, was that interview with Ruth and I. And if you didn't catch it, honestly, it is just so incredible to hear my birth mother Ruth's story. And for the media to cover it, I am just so grateful. So, if Studio 10, if you ever listen into this podcast, can I just say thank you? Thank you for your willingness to share our story, no matter how our culture, whether it's Australia, the United States, or wherever, right? No matter how our culture tries to silence the truth, and women in particular, men included, right? But in particular, really women whose stories don't fit the predominant narrative of abortion as a choice and a right. Just thank you for sharing it. And this is my challenge to all media, to be willing to share these stories. If that's journalism, right? If journalism is about sharing stories and sharing stories that will impact people's lives, then I would love to see journalists step forward and share more stories like Ruth's and mine and other abortion survivors and other women who regret their abortion. So far we have walked through episodes 1 through episode 7 of this initial season of the Life Empowers podcast. Stay tuned. The next podcast episode will be my second portion of wrapping up, really doing a recap of the highlights of this podcast. Thank you so much for your support, not only of the Life Empowers podcast, but of the Abortion Survivors Network, and certainly me personally. I am just blessed to be friends with so many of you that tune in, and to have so many of you as colleagues and as friends in the movement for people to have help and hope, and abortion survivors and the unborn to be humanized. Thanks for joining me this week on Life Empowers. I hope you found our time together to be life-affirming, hope-building, encouraging, informative. And remember, the next time someone states that abortion is empowering, you know better. Life empowers. See you again next week.